If someone from the general public saw a tricker, they would very often assume what they're doing is called parkour. And it's this age-old problem that has not only upset people who do parkour, but also the trickers who have longed for tricking to be acknowledged as its own sport. So there have been times where trickers and freerunners haven't really got along. The two would often make fun of each other.
What do you do?
I do parkour! I do parkour!
Gymnastic sprung floors is where trickers and freerunners often come face to face. These have become these tense, Cold War-like zones, as each side would battle for control of the sprung floor. The trickers believed the floor was theirs by birthright, so they would use the full radius of these floors just to practice a round-off backflip. But freerunners believed that the sprung floor belonged to them, so they would obnoxiously slap these big foam blocks in the middle of it so that they could launch themselves through the air and practice dive kongs. But alas, as time passed, so did this tension. Trickers and freerunners realised they weren't that dissimilar. And now in 2021, the relationship between tricking and parkour is closer than ever. So close, in fact, that some might wonder, is tricking taking over parkour? In today's video, we will explore exactly that. As a side note, the parkour bucket list is out now on my website. It's been really cool seeing you guys tag me on Instagram with your completed posters, so I'll leave a link to that below. To start off, tricking and parkour are fundamentally different sports. Unlike parkour and freerunning, which people have pedantically argued over for the last few decades, tricking is very much its own separate discipline, with its own unique heritage and its own culture. Originally dubbed sports martial arts, tricking evolved from combining the more aesthetic side of martial arts into these sequences of tricks. There's no obstacles or anything, other than the floor and a human body. Objectively, what a tricker is trying to do is seamlessly flow in tricks one into another. But as a result of using flips, tricking has often been lumped in with parkour and freerunning by the general public.
Trickers, tracers, freerunners, it's a whole new language.
Which has annoyed both freerunners and trickers. Despite these two sports being trained quite differently, there is a lot of overlap. For starters, when it comes to the tricks that trickers do, most of those tricks freerunners will also do. Certain connective moves that trickers will do between tricks might not be seen in freerunning, but most of the movements are seen in both. Also, much like freerunning, tricking doesn't really have any rules. There's nothing really telling you what you can or can't do. If you can think it up in your head, you can do it. This is distinctly different from gymnastic floor routines, despite being done in the same location.
Difficult routine starting at a 6.9 in difficulty.
In gymnastics, there's an extremely strict rule set for what flips are allowed and what aren't allowed. For instance, corks, side flips, and most of the flips that you see right here, none of these would score a single point in gymnastics. They're quite literally illegal in gymnastics. On top of this, there's even more overlap because trickers train in gymnastics centres, which is where you will also find freerunners who are trying to learn flips before they take them outside onto concrete. Lastly, trickers and freerunners do, at times, train together. In fact, many freerunners might even admit to being a tricker. It's a weird one because sure, there were tensions between the more pure parkour end of the sport, who saw flips as pointless, and then the annoyed trickers who were fed up of having their sport mislabeled. However, there were some freerunners, also known as traitors, who in the dark of night would sneak across enemy lines and would join the trickers in their pagan rituals of doing flips on flat ground. These rebels, little did they know, would actually go on to pioneer a whole new style of parkour throughout the 2010s, which now in 2021 has effectively created its own distinct subgenre of freerunning. But before we talk about that, let's look at how tricking's integration into parkour slowly evolved. So back in the 2000s, whilst parkour was having its meteoric rise in the media, the sport of tricking was quietly doing the same thing. Tricking was said to have really developed into its own thing around the 90s. Coincidentally, this was the exact same time as parkour and freerunning. But tricking got somewhat overshadowed by parkour and freerunning across the media.
It's probably the most acrobatic way to get from A to B.
It's parkour or free running.
This was because parkour was starting to feature in some major films, and it's just generally cooler than tricking. Okay, I'm joking. Being serious though, I think the reason that parkour kind of overshadowed tricking was because parkour just seamlessly fit into chase scenes that were featured all across cinema. If James Bond and Sebastian Foucan didn't have a chase scene but instead had a tricking battle, I don't know if it would have been the same film. Before mainstream attention throughout the 90s, parkour and tricking largely stayed completely separate. But that would all change in one instant. One day, freerunners realised they needn't keep slamming their bodies against concrete if they want to learn how to do a front flip. But instead they could go to what was effectively an adult soft play area and launch their bodies through space with zero consequence. Throughout the early 2000s, freerunners flocked to gymnastic halls all over the world to learn moves that were far too risky to attempt outside, unless you're a Russian, of course. As these gleeful freerunners lined up to attend their first gym sesh, the doors flung open, and it was at this point they would come face to face with the elusive Tricker. An army of freerunners charged through the doors, grabbing crash mats, foam blocks, and frothing at the mouth at the thought of all the double kongs they could now send. As Armageddon broke out, these trickers watched with despair as their sacred sprung floor was now littered with foam blocks and sweaty freerunner kids. This created a passive-aggressive feud that would go on for years. During this time, doing parkour at a gym became very popular. The Walters and Sheaf series was pretty much the epitome of gym parkour. These two would do crazy stunts that were only possible in a gym, and their videos would go completely viral in the early days of social media. However, as silly as this all looks, the moment that freerunners walked into a gymnastics centre was the start of a pivotal change within parkour itself. These freerunner kids would actually start to get good at doing flips. And by good, I don't mean being able to send a janky backflip at the end of a line. Freerunners were starting to be able to do hard tricks and actually put them into parkour lines. They started to perfect their understanding of flips and aerial awareness. This would give them the general confidence to start getting more creative with their flips. I made a whole video on how freerunners develop the backflip. And in that video, I talk a lot about the Kong Gainer and why that was such an important moment for the whole sport. And I made a different video about how freerunners learnt to flip to handrails. Most of these crazy moves that you see today would likely have never happened if freerunners never stepped foot inside of a gym. So what came of the feud between trickers and freerunners? Well, if you put two enemies in one room, one of two things will happen. Either they'll go to war and one will reign victorious, or they'll learn to get along. As time would pass, more freerunners would start to do tricking. And some trickers would even start to take up parkour. Trickers would lend their understanding of momentum and aerial awareness, and parkour athletes would lend their knowledge of vaults, climbs, and jumps. Athletes such as Ryan Doyle, Tim Sheaf, Daniel Ilabaka would become more and more popular for their style of freerunning that had roots in tricking, martial arts, breakdance, and all sorts. And they would actually start to create something very unique. Instead of just doing a front flip at the end of a line, they were instead learning to combo flips together during their runs. In the early days of this style, flips were not often very well integrated. It was often that you would see a very hard trick just done isolated on its own but off of a wall, rather than cleanly placed in the middle of a line like you would see today. Teams like FreeRunTube would capitalise off this flip-heavy style of freerunning, and like I discussed in my parkour vs freerunning video, this created two factions within the sport. There was people who trained like FreeRunTube, and then there was pure parkour people. And most of the time they didn't really mix, and they would stay quite separate of each other. But there would be one very important outlier who would break down this invisible wall between parkour and freerunning, and that was Daniel Ilabaka. Danny would show people that you could integrate flips into extremely hard parkour lines, and that it needn't be one or the other. Danny was a very important athlete in bridging the gap between these two styles of movement, and that's because there wasn't a single person who could talk crap on how Danny moved. If you were the purest parkour person on earth, Danny would no doubt be 10 times better than you. And likewise, even if you were the most creative freerunner on earth, Danny would have been better than you. Danny was just better than everyone. He was on this different level when it came to movement. Danny was able to look both elegant and weightless, whilst looking powerful and strong. And throughout his time being a prominent athlete in the sport, Danny completely revolutionised people's understanding of parkour. All of this leads us to now, 2021, where this brand new style of movement has kind of come around in the last year or so. This is a style of hybrid tricking and parkour, which, unlike the free-running style of Daniel Ilabaka, which was parkour lines with tricking mixed into it, this new style is effectively tricking lines with parkour mixed into it. So this isn't just a one-off big flip or a flip gap or anything like that, but rather this is a continuous flow of flips strung together across obstacles. Archie Arroyan, who is someone I featured in my top 10 most creative freerunner list, he is a perfect example of this new style. He's able to perfectly link together flips across obstacles. There is absolutely no dead space in any of his lines, and that's where the tricking influence comes in. In more parkour-focused lines, there'll often be a section where you have to run across, so that you can get to the next obstacle. Whereas in tricking, the idea is to never leave any dead space and everything connects perfectly into the next thing. NicoFlow12 on Instagram is also another perfect example of this. It was pretty much popped off in the last year or two with no prior parkour experience. He started messing with some parkour things about 2 or 3 years ago, after having a long background in tricking, which has in turn led him to develop his own completely unique style. And he's arguably one of the best in the game at this style. And then we have the more Lotus Ninja inspired style. This style has inspired and led to athletes like Josh Malone and his team Beans Out the Can. What's a little bit different about these guys is the fact that they'll use off-axis flips and grabs. It's kind of new, it's not something you often see. So all of this leads me to a question, and that is this good for parkour? Because this style seems to be growing a lot lately and getting a lot of attention. And I wonder, could it overshadow the more pure parkour people? Well look, I consider it like this. There will be a kid out there who loves doing flips on his trampoline, and that kid might not be inspired by the more pure parkour athletes like Max Cave. However, that same kid might be absolutely mesmerised by someone like NicoFlow. He might see NicoFlow and go, I want to learn that. And then that is that kid's into the world of movement, where over time he might develop an interest for athletes like Max Cave. However, that hypothetical situation would never have happened if NicoFlow didn't exist. On top of that, this style can inspire other athletes who might have been in the sport for a long time, and it might give them new ideas on what they can do. It's this exact influence that in the past has led to incredible things like flip precisions. Things passively inspire and influence each other. And not only that, but from an athlete's perspective, learning tricking is super important. I would say that every athlete should learn how to trick, or at least some basics. The level of aerial awareness and bodily control that you get from tricking is pretty unparalleled. And you can see this in how NicoFlow and Bagel's Pain have pretty seamlessly transitioned into parkour after a very short time. There's just a level of understanding of where you are in the air that only comes from being really good at tricking. And I think it's utterly vital for any athlete who really wants to take parkour seriously. And speaking from personal experience, I've done parkour for 10 years now. After 10 years of doing purely parkour-based movements, over time it can get a little bit tired. And it's very easy to plateau in terms of enjoyment. Last year, I made the conscious effort to learn how to trick, or at least do flips.
Oh, that was so much better.
Over summer, I learnt cheat gainers and I took them outside onto concrete, and I haven't felt that level of achievement in a long time.
Yes!
And if you follow me on Instagram, you'll see that I've been battling to get B-twists for the longest time, and just recently I got them outside.
Yes!
I've been using this platform called Kojo's Trick Lab, which basically teaches you everything you need to know about tricking and flips. And I'm super happy that they've decided to sponsor today's video, with a very generous offer for a £1 sign-up cost for your first month. I watched their 45-minute ultimate B-twist lesson, which in just a week took me to do B-twists outside. Kojo, who's well known in the tricking world, has built this platform from the ground up, employing top-level trickers to teach what they're best at. There is literally 300 plus hours of deep dive instructional videos on how to trick, across 500 videos. So for your £1 first month, check the links in the description and go and sign up. Anyway, all that aside, there are some athletes who will say, I just don't really like the style. And look, I get that this tricking style isn't going to be to everyone's taste, and it never used to be to me. But the thing is, just because you or I are not inspired by a certain style of movement doesn't take away from the fact that other people are inspired by it. And some people might feel that this style will dilute the message of parkour, what parkour is. But the way I see it, that's just how arts evolve. There is a very real danger of suppressing the evolution of arts. If you take the UK music genre of grime, in an interview, a rapper called AJ Tracy, who was an absolute OG of grime, basically said that grime died because of an inner circle of fans and musicians who just wouldn't let the music evolve.
Tell you why. Grime, everyone would be still bothered about grime if, as grime was changing, everyone changed with it. But like they don't. They just want that nostalgic Dizzy Rascal. You get me? So because of that, as grime's changing, they shun whoever's changing, like trying to do something different.
The same could be said for why gymnastics has stagnated, and probably a reason why they're trying to take control of parkour. Personally, I can only see this hybrid style evolving and spreading the movement to more people. I hope it spreads the message of the sport and makes it more accessible, and gives a deeper appreciation for the athletes I love and the culture around them. But let me know what you think of Trickin's influence in the world of parkour. Like this video and subscribe to the channel, and check out Kojo's Trick Lab. And finally, go get yourself a parkour bucket list. Peace.